The morning air at the Naval Academy carried a crispness that hinted at both ceremony and memory. Rows of young men and women stood tall in their uniforms, boots polished to perfection, caps glinting under the muted sun. Among them sat families, faces alive with pride and anticipation. Yet in the middle of it all, one woman seemed to hold a presence apart, not louder, not brighter, but steadier, like an anchor in restless waters. Her name was Claire Donovan. She wore a simple white blouse, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. At first glance, she looked like any proud mother watching her child graduate into the Navy. But those who looked longer noticed something more, an intensity in her gaze, a quiet gravity in the way she stood. Claire had once worn the uniform herself, though she no longer carried its insignia. What she carried instead was memory, marked not just in her heart, but on her skin. The tattoo was hidden beneath the fold of her sleeve, an intricate design inked years ago during her service. It was not for ornament, not for fashion, but for remembrance. Each line and pattern told a story of her time overseas, of comrades lost and moments survived. That mark was as much a medal as any she had received, etched into her as a testament to lives intertwined in struggle and sacrifice. She rarely spoke of it. For her, silence was its own kind of reverence. The academy grounds echoed with the sound of commands, the rhythmic stomp of boots moving in unison. Claire's breath caught as she watched the young graduates march past. Among them was her son, his chin lifted, eyes fixed forward. The sight filled her chest with something that was both pride and ache, an ache born of knowing too well what lay ahead for him. She wanted to hold him still, to shield him from the hardships she had endured, yet she knew she could not. The path of service was both his choice and his inheritance. Her own path had begun much the same way. She had enlisted in her early 20s, driven by a mixture of duty and determination. The world had seemed sharper then, its edges clear. She had believed in courage the way others believed in prayer. The years that followed reshaped her, sanding down some of that sharpness and deepening her understanding of sacrifice. She had carried rifles through dust-choked air, patched wounds with trembling hands, and learned to sleep with one ear open to the sound of helicopters overhead. She had returned home with both medals and ghosts, carrying them quietly into her new life as a mother. Now, as the graduates were called one by one, she stood straighter, her heart steadying with each name announced. A Navy commander walked the line, pausing to shake hands, his own uniform heavy with decades of service. When his gaze swept across the families in attendance, it lingered on her. Not because she sought attention, but because the tattoo beneath her rolled sleeve had shifted into view. It was only a glimpse, the edge of an angular design visible against her arm. But for those who knew its meaning, it was unmistakable. The commander's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in recognition. Claire felt the weight of his glance, but did not flinch. She had long ago stopped hiding who she was. The tattoo had been earned in places where silence fell heavier than words, and to have it acknowledged now was less about exposure than about truth. She exhaled slowly, letting the moment pass as the commander moved on. Around her, the ceremony continued, the band striking up a march, applause breaking out as each graduate saluted and stepped forward. Claire let her gaze drift back to her son, standing with a steadiness that reminded her of herself years ago. She wondered if he, too, would carry invisible scars, if someday he would sit in her place, remembering what it felt like to serve. For now, she allowed herself a small smile. The sun caught her hair, the breeze lifted the corners of the flag behind the stage, and the world seemed to pause just long enough for her to breathe in the fullness of the moment. She was both mother and veteran, present and remembered, past and present stitched together by the ink on her arm and the pride in her chest. Claire did not need applause, nor did she seek recognition. Her honor was in her son's eyes, in the future he was stepping into, and in the unspoken acknowledgement that her own story lived on, not in the shadows of her past, but in the steady light of today. The ceremony ended with the precision of tradition, marching boots, folded flags, the thunder of applause rising and fading into the afternoon sky. Families spilled onto the academy grounds, laughter mingling with tears as graduates embraced their loved ones. Claire moved through the crowd slowly, her eyes fixed on her son. He broke formation with his classmates, his face alight with pride, his stride quickening when he saw her. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tighter than words could express. The sharp scent of pressed wool from his uniform, the warmth of his back beneath her hands, it all pulled at something deep inside her. For a moment she allowed herself to forget the weight of memory, to hold him simply as her son. But memory is not easily set aside. As she released him, her gaze flickered toward the stage where the commander still stood. His eyes found hers again, brief but deliberate, as though he had recognized more than just the ink on her arm. She lowered her sleeve out of habit, though the gesture was not shame but defense. Recognition could mean questions, and questions could reopen doors she had carefully closed. That night, alone in her hotel room, Claire sat at the edge of the bed and traced the outline of the tattoo with her fingertips. The ink had faded slightly with time, its once black lines now softened into dark blue. Each stroke carried a memory, some honorable, some unbearable. She remembered one night in particular, years ago, when the desert air had been thick with dust and heat. She and her unit had huddled in the shadow of an Apache, reloading its ammunition as the sky burned orange with the last light of day. Her hands had trembled then, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Hours of carrying crates, of listening to the distant thump of rotor blades and the ever-present hum of danger, had drained her body, but sharpened her spirit. It was after that deployment, after the loss of two friends whose names were now etched in stone, that she had chosen the tattoo. It was not decorative, it was a vow. To remember, to carry forward, to never let the silence of absence erase the voices of those who had gone. But vows can become burdens. In the years since, Claire had struggled to balance the past with the present. Nightmares sometimes returned with cruel clarity, explosions that left her ears ringing, the metallic tang of blood on the air, the sight of helmets abandoned in the dust. She had built a life beyond those memories, raising her son with tenderness and quiet strength, but some nights even her calmest smile could not keep the shadows at bay. She had never spoken to him of the worst days. He knew she had served, that she had been in places few civilians could imagine, but she had shielded him from the sharpest edges of that truth. Now, seeing him in uniform, she wondered if silence had been protection or denial. The following morning, she walked the academy grounds before sunrise. The flag still hung high on the pole, its colors muted in the early light. The sound of gulls wheeling overhead carried across the quiet courtyard. She paused near the steps, her hands sliding into her pockets, her shoulders lifting with a slow breath. A voice startled her. "You served." She turned to see the commander from the ceremony. He stood a few feet away, his cap tucked under his arm, his expression unreadable but not unkind. Claire inclined her head. "Yes, sir." "Army?" he asked. "Army Aviation," she answered softly. "Crew chief." His gaze flicked briefly to her arm, then back to her eyes. "I thought I recognized that mark. Not many carry it." Claire hesitated, her pulse steady but heavy.
"No."
"Not many." For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of wind and the distant sound of water lapping against the dock. Then the commander nodded once, respectfully. "It means you've carried more than most." She swallowed, her throat tightening. "We all carried something." He didn't press her further. With a quiet nod, he replaced his cap and walked on, leaving her alone again with the flag and the sunrise. Yet his words lingered, both a recognition and a reminder. Claire stood there for a long time, letting the light spread across the grounds. She felt the familiar ache rise in her chest, but with it came something gentler, a strange kind of relief. Perhaps her past did not need to be hidden after all. Perhaps it could be honored, quietly but openly, as part of who she was. When she returned to her room, her son was waiting, still in his uniform from the day before. He looked at her with the unspoken curiosity of a man beginning to see his mother not only as a parent, but as someone who had lived her own battles. "Mom," he said softly, "tell me about it someday." The tattoo. She met his gaze, her heart heavy and hopeful at once. She reached out, resting her hand against a shoulder. "Someday," she whispered, her voice steady, though inside her memories stirred like distant thunder. The evening air was gentle, carrying with it the faint scent of salt water from the nearby coast. Claire and her son sat on a bench outside the academy dorms, the golden wash of sunset softening the sharp edges of the world. He had insisted on walking her back after dinner, and now they lingered, neither of them quite ready to let the day end. Her son leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. The crisp lines of his uniform were now slightly rumpled, but his posture still carried the discipline of his training. Claire studied him quietly, noticing the resemblance to his father in the curve of his jaw, the steadiness in his gaze. But there was more of her in him too, the quiet endurance, the strength that hid beneath stillness. He broke the silence first. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said softly, "but I want to understand. Not just the tattoo. You." Claire's breath caught. She had waited years for this, for him to see her not just as his mother, but as a woman shaped by her own trials. Yet now that the moment had arrived, words felt fragile, too small to hold the weight of memory. She clasped her hands in her lap, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her sleeve. "The tattoo," she began slowly. "It's for them. The ones who didn't come back." He turned his head, his brow furrowing, waiting. Her eyes drifted to the flag fluttering faintly above the dormitory. "We were in the desert. Long deployments. Some days felt endless. Dust in your teeth, heat pressing down until even your bones felt heavy. Nights were worse. The silence could swallow you whole until the sound of rotors or distant fire would snap you awake." She paused, closing her eyes briefly as images surfaced. The sandstorms that blurred the horizon. The copper smell of spent ammunition. The sudden crack of gunfire that split one evening apart, leaving only echoes behind. "We lost 2 in my unit. Good men. Brothers, in every way that mattered. I made a promise to carry them with me, always. That tattoo, it's not decoration. It's remembrance." Her son sat very still, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her words. Claire could see the questions forming in his eyes, the ache of wanting to know more and the fear of what knowing might cost. "Was it worth it?" he asked finally. His voice was steady, but there was a rawness beneath it. Claire's throat tightened. She had asked herself the same question countless times. "Worth is complicated," she answered gently. "There were moments when I wondered if we were just shadows moving in circles, losing pieces of ourselves for reasons too big to see. But then I remember the faces. The people we helped, the lives we protected. Sometimes it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing there when no one else could." The last light of the day slipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of rose and gold. Her son leaned back, his gaze fixed on her now, not the horizon. "You carried that alone all these years," he said quietly. Claire shook her head. "Not alone, but quietly. I didn't want you to grow up with my ghosts. I wanted you to have your own dreams, your own path." A silence settled between them, heavy yet tender. Then, almost imperceptibly, he reached for her hand. His grip was firm, grounding. For the first time in years, Claire felt the walls inside her shift, not collapsing but softening. It was in that touch, that simple gesture, that she understood something she had resisted for so long. She did not need to carry memory in silence. Her story did not diminish him. It could strengthen him. Her scars did not cast shadows over his path. They could offer light. She inhaled deeply, the cool evening air filling her chest. "There's more," she said softly. "And if you want to hear it, I'll tell you. Not all at once, but someday, piece by piece." He nodded, his eyes glistening in the fading light. "I want to know everything. Because it's you. And because maybe it'll help me, too." Claire felt the corners of her mouth lift in a small, fragile smile. She squeezed his hand gently, letting the moment rest between them. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky brushed with indigo. Somewhere in the distance, the academy bells began to chime, their notes carrying across the still air like a quiet benediction. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt no need to hide the ink on her arm. She rolled her sleeve higher, letting it breathe in the open air. Her son looked at it not with fear or confusion, but with reverence, understanding that it was not only a mark of the past, but a bridge to the future. And in that shared silence, mother and son sat together, bound not by unspoken weight, but by the strength of a story finally beginning to be told. The day was already warm when Claire stepped outside, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and early blossoms. Her hands brushed against the wooden railing of the porch, rough and familiar, grounding her as the quiet world of the morning stretched out before her. It was the kind of silence she had once longed for in faraway places, yet now it often carried its own weight. She had been invited to speak at a nearby high school that afternoon. The principal had written to her weeks ago, explaining that the students were studying resilience, leadership, and service. Your story, the letter had said, might help them understand courage in a way books cannot. Claire folded the letter into her pocket the day it came, uncertain whether she could bear to stand before so many young faces, their lives still untouched by the sharp edges of war. Yet something in the request had tugged at her, a call not unlike the one she'd answered years ago, though quieter, gentler. The gymnasium buzzed when she entered later that day. Rows of metal chairs squeaked as students shifted, teachers whispered from the sides, and the hum of a microphone tested the air. Claire moved to the podium slowly, her boots clicking softly against the polished floor. The sound carried her back to gravel paths of desert outposts, to the shuffle of her unit walking in unison beneath burning skies. She looked at them, the students, restless and curious, some leaning forward, others slouched in adolescent indifference. A small smile touched her lips. She had been young once too, wide-eyed and reckless, dreaming of flight. Her voice trembled at first, but it steadied as the story found her rhythm. She spoke not of battles won or medals earned, but of the mornings that began in sandstorms, of letters folded and reread by dim light, of the ache of watching a friend board a helicopter and not return. She told them about laughter that burst suddenly, stubbornly, even in the midst of fear, and about the unshakable bond that forms when lives are held in each other's hands. The students grew quiet, their gazes fixed on her. She could feel the weight of their listening, and it humbled her. Somewhere between her words, she noticed her hands, open on the podium, palms upward, almost as if she were offering something she no longer carried for herself. When she finished, the silence lingered. It was not the awkward pause of polite applause waiting to break through. It was a silence that meant they had felt something. Then, slowly, a single student rose. His voice, thin and unsure, carried across the gym. "Did it change you?" The question pierced deeper than any she had expected. She breathed in, steadying, her eyes tracing the boy's face, so young, so intent. "Yes," she said softly. "It changed everything. It taught me the weight of sacrifice, but also the depth of love. I came home with scars some you cannot see, but I also came home with a strength I never knew I had, the strength to keep going, to rebuild, to honor those who could not." Her words hung there, fragile yet unshakable. She felt the ripple in the room, the way shoulders straightened, the way a few heads bowed as though in respect. Afterward, students clustered around her, asking questions, thanking her, some too shy to speak but offering tentative smiles that spoke volumes. Claire listened, nodded, answered gently, letting their voices fill the spaces that had once been occupied by the roar of engines and the sharp crack of distant fire. Later, when the gym had emptied and the custodians swept the last of the programs into a bin, Claire lingered. She sat on the edge of the stage, her legs dangling like a child's, her gaze sweeping across the empty rows of chairs. She thought of the faces she had just seen, their youth, their hope, and something softened in her chest. For years, she had wondered what it meant to come back, what purpose her own survival held. Today, she had glimpsed an answer. Perhaps it was not about carrying her own story alone, but about placing it gently into the hands of others, allowing it to shape, guide, and steady them in ways she might never fully see. Outside, the sun had shifted lower, casting golden streaks across the floor. She rose, her body aching slightly, but her spirit lighter. The sound of distant laughter drifted from the parking lot where students spilled into the evening. Claire let it reach her, warm and unguarded, and she smiled. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel like a woman standing apart. She felt woven back into the fabric of life, messy, hopeful, unpredictable. And in that quiet moment, she understood. Her journey was not only about remembering the past. It was also about offering pieces of it forward, so that courage, once born of hardship, might live again in others. She walked into the fading light, each step steady, carry. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that wrapped itself around the small town like a soft blanket. Claire sat by her window, a notebook open on her lap. The paper remained mostly blank, save for a few words scrawled at the top. Letters I never sent. She had begun this ritual weeks ago, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the act of writing without expectation, without the need for reply. Perhaps it was her way of giving shape to the thoughts that had lived too long inside her. Tonight, her pen hovered, hesitant, before finally touching the page. "Dear Anna," she wrote, her handwriting slow, careful. Anna had been one of her closest friends in the service, sharp-witted, endlessly kind, the one who had known how to make everyone laugh, even in the darkest stretches of deployment. Anna had not made it home. Claire paused, the weight of memory pressing heavy on her chest. She could almost hear Anna's voice teasing her for being too serious, for carrying the world's burdens as though they were hers alone. The echo of that laughter was both comfort and ache. The words came haltingly at first, then steadier. She wrote about the high school gym, about the students' questions, about the moment she had felt something shift inside her. She wrote about the silence that followed her story, a silence full of reverence, and how it had felt like Anna was there, sitting just beyond the rows of chairs, nodding with approval. Tears blurred the ink, but she didn't wipe them away. The page filled, line after line, until her hand ached and her heart felt lighter, as though the act of giving Anna her story had freed some part of her soul. She closed the notebook gently, her fingers tracing the worn cover, and leaned back in the chair. Outside, the moon cast a silver glow across the yard, the branches of the old oak stretching like open arms. For the first time in a long while, she felt that the night did not demand anything of her. It simply held her as she was. The next morning came with a scent of coffee drifting through the kitchen and sunlight pouring across the wooden floor. Claire moved slowly, savoring the warmth of the mug in her hands, the simple ritual of beginning another day. She had an appointment at the Veteran Center, not for herself this time, but to sit in on a group she had been asked to help lead. The room at the center was modest, with mismatched chairs arranged in a loose circle. Men and women filtered in, some with canes, some with weary eyes, some with shoulders squared in the way of people still carrying invisible weight. Claire greeted them softly, shaking hands, offering smiles. When the group began, there was hesitation. Stories were not easy to spill into open air. But gradually, words found their way forward. A young man spoke about sleepless nights, another about struggling to return to school, a woman about the silence of her home since her partner hadn't come back. Claire listened, her heart leaning toward each of them, her silence an offering of space. And when it was her turn, she did not recount the whole of her past. She spoke simply of the gymnasium, of the students, of how she had realized that even broken stories could build bridges for others. Her voice was steady, but her chest tightened as she looked around the circle. In their eyes, she saw herself mirrored, 1,000 fragments of pain, but also sparks of resilience, glowing quietly beneath the surface. The session ended with no grand conclusion, just the soft shuffle of chairs and murmured goodbyes. Yet as they left, one by one, Claire felt something settle deep inside her. She understood now that healing was not only about finding her own peace, it was about holding space for others to find theirs too. Later, walking home beneath the wide blue sky, Claire felt the crisp air against her skin, heard the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. Each sound, each breath, carried her further into the present. She paused at the edge of her yard, looking at the porch where her notebook waited inside. She thought of Anna again, of the way her laughter had once cut through fear like sunlight through storm clouds. A smile curved her lips, gentle but sure. She whispered into the breeze, not with grief this time, but with quiet gratitude. "I'm still carrying you with me." The wind rustled through the trees, and Claire stood for a long moment, letting the sound wash over her. It did not feel like goodbye, it felt like a thread, woven across time, binding her past to her present, her pain to her purpose. And as she stepped inside, the day unfolding around her, she realized that her story was no longer just about surviving. It was about offering light where shadows lingered, and strength where silence had once reigned. The auditorium had emptied hours ago, yet the echoes of celebration still lingered in the air like faint music clinging to the rafters. Amelia sat alone in one of the back rows, her hands resting quietly on her knees, the fabric of her dress uniform neat and pressed but worn with the weight of memory. The day had been monumental for her son, his graduation into the Brotherhood of the Navy SEALs, but for Amelia, it had stirred something far more intimate. It had unlocked chambers of her past she thought she had sealed forever. She tilted her head back, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams where light pooled in gentle halos. In those moments of stillness, her mind carried her far from the ceremony and back to deserts where the air shimmered with heat and the nights whispered with uncertainty. She could almost feel the grit against her skin again, hear the shuffle of boots over sand, the metallic clatter of ammo boxes, and the deep, grounding hum of Apache blades in the distance. It had been there, in the dust, in the unrelenting sun, that she carried her burden silently, hiding strength and fragility in equal measure. And it had been there, too, that she bore the tattoo the commander had glimpsed that afternoon, a small, inked fragment of her past, a symbol not of rebellion but of a vow she once made to herself and to those she lost. Her son hadn't asked about it yet. Perhaps he was giving her space, perhaps he feared the answer, or perhaps he already knew in his heart what it meant. But Amelia knew the question would come, and when it did, she would not turn away. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. She turned her head and saw him. Daniel, her son, walking down the aisle toward her. His steps were still purposeful, carrying the sharpness of new discipline, but his shoulders held a gentleness that was all his own. "Mom," he said softly, settling into the seat beside her. His voice carried both fatigue and awe. "I didn't think you'd stay behind." She smiled faintly, her lips curving as if caught between pride and sorrow. "I needed a moment," she replied. "Sometimes after everything, you just need to sit still and breathe it in." Daniel studied her in silence, his eyes reflecting questions he wasn't sure how to voice. Then, with a careful hesitation, he said, "When the commander saw your tattoo today, he looked like he knew something. Like it meant something more than what I understand." Amelia inhaled slowly, the air filling her chest with both weight and release. She had known this moment would arrive, but the gentleness in his tone steadied her more than she expected. She lowered her gaze to her hands, tracing the faint scars across her knuckles before lifting her sleeve just enough to reveal the ink once more. "It's not just a tattoo," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's a memory, a promise. I had it done after a mission that changed me. It was the night I realized that not everyone comes home, and that carrying their names in my heart would never be enough. I needed a mark I could never forget, one that would remind me of who I was and of the people who walked beside me." Her son listened, his breath catching in the stillness between her words. She went on, each sentence pulling threads of her past into the present. "I wasn't always strong, Daniel. There were nights I thought I would break, mornings I wondered if I had the right to keep going. But then I would feel the weight of that ink, and I would remember. Not just the pain, but the love, the loyalty, the way we held each other up when everything else was falling apart. A silence lingered between them, tender and raw. Daniel's eyes softened, and he placed his hand over hers, the calluses of his training pressing against the faded roughness of her skin. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he whispered. For a moment, Amelia felt something shift inside her, like the release of a breath she had been holding for decades. Tears pricked her eyes, not of weakness, but of recognition. Her son was no longer the boy she had protected from her shadows. He was a man who now stood tall enough to share the weight. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw the reflection of her own journey in his. The same quiet courage, the same unspoken resilience, the same stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. And in that realization, she felt the circle of her life close in a way she had never imagined. The tattoo, once a private wound, now became something else, an heirloom of resilience, a testament not just to those she lost, but to the strength she had passed on. As they sat there in the empty auditorium, the world outside dimming into the tender hues of evening, Amelia reached for his hand and held it firmly. "Whatever battles you face," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "remember that you come from people who endured. You carry more than just your own strength, you carry ours. And that will always be enough." The words lingered in the quiet, neither heavy nor light, but whole. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight with emotion, and leaned gently against her shoulder. For the first time in years, Amelia felt not just a survivor of her past, but a mother standing in the light of her son's future. And in that moment, wrapped in silence, memory, and the promise of tomorrow, she knew she had finally found peace.